Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look for the last time at the 2025 New Jersey gubernatorial election. It is, of course, election day, so please go out and vote if you haven't done so already. I voted on Sunday. I knew today was going to be a busy day for me, so I got it out of the way this weekend thanks to early voting. But if you haven't done that, please go out and make your voice heard. And even if if you don't live in New Jersey or Virginia, there's still a lot of elections. I don't live in New Jersey or Virginia, but I got out and I cast my ballot in a couple of local elections. So there's a lot to do today. But one of the things we have to do today is talk for the final time about New Jersey's election and make my final prediction. And we're going to start by looking at the polling data kind of as our baseline just to get right into it. And what you'll see is, pretty simple. Mikie Sherrill, the Democratic nominee, leads Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican, in every poll. Now, that is not to say that this race is boring. In fact, I think this race is going to be super interesting to watch in just a few hours tonight because there's a lot at stake and a lot to look out for. I'd go out and maybe say that this race is competitive. I think both candidates have a real shot at winning. Of course, I'm going to pick a winner at the end of the video, and I think that one candidate is favored, but do not let these, numbers deceive you. There are a lot of reasons to think this race could be close. And we're going to start with one of them, which is the Atlas Intel poll from a couple of days ago over the weekend. It had Mikie Sherrill up by only 1%. And this is, as you can see, this is well within the margin of error. This is not at all, showing a race that's out of reach for Jack Ciattarelli. It's saying a, statistical tie with Sherrill up by 1. So, a lot of people like Atlas Intel. They were a very good pollster in 2024. They've been a little shakier in the past, especially in off-year elections, but they've had a couple years where they've really nailed it in a way that no other poll has. So make of that what you will. I wouldn't, like I said when this poll came out, I'm not changing my outlook on the race dramatically based on one poll, no matter who it is, but I do think it's a data point worth analyzing pretty rigorously just because it does show a race that is legitimately close. We also see some similar results from like Suffolk, which has Sherrill only up by 4. This is a bit less close, but they have a lot of undecided voters. And obviously with Sherrill only at 46% as a Democrat, if undecideds break against her, that could be a loss right there. YouGov had it a bit less close. They had Sherrill up by 10. This was one of the better polls that Sherrill's gotten in the past 2 weeks. She's up by a solid 54-44 margin. But of course, we have to consider is that YouGov has in the past been a little bit favorable to Democrats. The past couple of cycles wasn't really the case in 2022, but in 2018, 2020, and 2024, there was a bit of a problem for them. So just keep that in mind. Quinnipiac is similar. They had Sherrill up by 8. And then Fox, this is a good poll for Sherrill. They initially had her only up by, I think, 5%. If we go to their poll from the middle of October, she was up by 5. And then if we check back in at the end of October, she's up by 7. So we see a little bit of movement towards Mikie Sherrill in most polls. She does have a bit of an advantage, but Jack Ciattarelli definitely got some good news by that Atlas Intel poll, which has him well within striking distance. So the polls can tell us a couple of things. On average, Sherrill's up by probably, 4 to 6 points in these polls. But the bigger question to me is, what does the electorate look like? Now, if we go to 2021, the electorate was very favorable to Republicans. Jack Ciattarelli, certainly a familiar face at this point to most people in New Jersey. He had the benefit of running in an environment that was pretty Republican. 2021 was a good year for Republicans. Obviously, this is the same day that they flipped to Virginia, that they won the legislature, or that they won the state house in Virginia, and that they also won a couple of, important races like the Supreme Court race in Pennsylvania and, that kind of thing. So November 2nd, 2021 was a really good day for Republicans. They had pretty favorable turnout like across the board. But one thing that I will say, and this is really, really important to note, is that even though Republicans had good turnout, they also had good persuasion. Swing voters legitimately broke for Jack Ciattarelli in New Jersey. Some of them voted for Biden the year prior. And we saw a lot of Biden voters in Virginia vote for Glenn Youngkin. So those two components, turnout and persuasion, both benefited Republicans. And you can kind of see that materializing in New Jersey. In last time we had this race for governor in Newark, specifically Essex and in Hudson counties. These are counties that are obviously very blue. Phil Murphy, the Democrat, still won them, but turnout was a lot lower there if you compare it to the presidential year. And obviously, turnout in any governor's race is lower than it will be. Like in every county in New Jersey, turnout fell from 2021 relative to 2020, but the fall off was more dramatic in Newark than it was in, say, the suburbs or in some of the redder parts of the state, which meant the electorate as a whole shifted towards Republicans just structurally. So we know that even though Mikie Sherrill is going to win, Essex and Hudson, what matters more is the turnout there and the margin she gets. Phil Murphy's margin here was actually pretty solid, but the turnout there was so bad that it ended up costing him tens of thousands of votes statewide to Ciattarelli on net. And then you can kind of see the persuasion element a little more in Morris County, where turnout was a bit lower, but not, it wasn't, super low relative to the rest of the state. And we just saw people change their votes. Morris County voted for Biden by about 4% in 2020. A year later, 12 months later, it was less than a year later, it swings, goes Ciattarelli by 11, and Ciattarelli won it by 20,000 votes. It wasn't even that close. So maybe some of that was a little bit of turnout advantage for Republicans, but there, we know empirically that there were Biden voters who voted for Jack Ciattarelli the following year. So what does all of this mean? Well, it's pretty simple, right? Turnout helps you, and turnout in 2021 benefited Republicans, but Ciattarelli made this a close race because he had a real advantage with persuasion. People just, changed their minds. They voted for him this time. So when we look at 2025, I think we can make a couple of educated guesses, or I like to say inferences based on the current data. I think that the early vote data paints a pretty clear picture. It doesn't tell us who's going to win, or, it doesn't really put one candidate out of the race, but it does show that Democrats are turning out better than they were in 2021, that Republicans are showing up a little bit less comparatively. So I think right off the bat, we can assume that the electorate in 2025 is going to be a bit more Democratic favorable than it was 4 years ago. And this is to be expected, right? Generally speaking, turnout favors the party out of power because they're more motivated, they're more energized. 2021 followed that rule. 2017 followed that rule, where Democrats won this race by 15 points, right? Even though Republicans held the seat, right? Chris Christie was the outgoing governor. Kim Guadagno, who was the lieutenant governor, ran as the Republican. She lost pretty decisively to Phil Murphy in 2017. So, right, like this has happened historically. It's not a surprise it's happening again. Now, do I know the extent to which turnout is going to favor Democrats? Not yet. We'll figure out tonight, most likely. But I do think it's going to be a bit bluer than it was in 2021, which is a boost to Mikie Sherrill. But the more important part of this is persuasion. Persuasion, obviously, could still save Jack Ciattarelli, even if the electorate's a little bit less favorable to him structurally than it was in 2021. So on persuasion, we have to kind of look at the polling data. In most polls, I'm not going to go through the crosstabs right now, but most polls do show Jack Ciattarelli winning independent voters. Now, crosstabs are wonky. We will get, like, the Atlas Intel poll, for example, had Ciattarelli winning black voters by 20 points. Black voters in New Jersey are usually like a Democrat plus 70 or 80 demographic, right? I don't think we're going to see an 100-point shift among black voters compared to 2024. But I do think that the consistency of these crosstabs that shows Ciattarelli winning independent voters is pretty significant, because New Jersey, obviously, ton of suburban turf where Democrats been improving, but Republicans are still competitive. Look at 2024, Morris County. I just highlighted this in the governor's race, which Ciattarelli won by 11 in 2021. Kamala Harris ran a lot stronger than Phil Murphy here, but she still lost it to Donald Trump by 2 points. It was still an 8,000 vote deficit for her in Morris County, right? So, I'd say New Jersey, there is a, there are a lot of votes to be had in these areas that are, not necessarily super locked on to one party or the other. And so based on the polling, you'd seem to think, okay, well, Jack Ciattarelli has some serious, room to win some votes in Morris County, or in Sussex County, which is, it's a little more exurban. And then you go to South Jersey, which has been trending right for, the past few election cycles. I'd say especially Atlantic and Cumberland and Salem. These are areas that are working class, that are typically blue collar, that are not necessarily in the primary were not as supportive of Mikie Sherrill as the northern part of the state. That's an area where Jack Ciattarelli has a real chance to make serious gains. And in 2021, he did very well here. He could maybe do even a little bit better, right? Like, look at 2024's results. A good example of this is Atlantic County and Cumberland County. Trump won these counties by 3. Ciattarelli won these by 12 and 11 in 2021. So he already has a bit of a base here. Phil Murphy did not do well here at all last time. That could be a big boost to Ciattarelli if he plays his cards right on election day, which we're going to find out about tonight. So those are two areas where I think, regardless of turnout, persuasion could really come in to boost Ciattarelli and keep him competitive statewide. The one thing I will say before we kind of move on from this little conversation about persuasion versus turnout is that early vote data, right, is important. It's possible, and so far, from what we know, I do think Democrats are looking at an electorate that's favorable to them, at least compared to 2021. But it's also possible on election day that changes. We could totally see on election day really bad turnout for Democrats in the cities, maybe really good turnout for Republicans in the suburbs and in the rural areas, as most election day turnout is going to be a bit more favorable to Republicans than early vote turnout. So we might see an electorate that is legitimately just not favorable to Democrats at all over the course of this afternoon and this evening. Obviously, I'm not going to predict that because I'm not going to release the prediction like half an hour before polls close. But based on the early vote data, I can make a pretty educated guess that we're not going to see a huge GOP like wave, even if there's still like a slight possibility Republicans improve a little bit on election day based on what we're expecting, if that makes sense. So just keep that in mind. Now, the last thing I want to say before we get on to the final prediction and kind of talk with some of the parts of the state we're going to look at tonight, I do think it's worth noting the polls right now are predicting a narrowly Democratic favorable electorate. They're not predicting like an electorate that's going to be a blue wave, like 2006, 2018 type electorate where Democrats just outvote Republicans by pretty substantial margins, which means that if election day turnout is bad for Republicans, I think Sherrill could win by 10 or 11, right? She could win pretty easily, I would say, if election day turnout is worse, which is the flip side, right, for Republicans. If turnout is worse on election day than we're expecting, it could get ugly real fast, in the same way that if it's better than expected, the race is still competitive. So with all that being said, let's now take a look at the regions of the state and kind of consider what we're looking out for tonight. So in 2024, obviously, Kamala Harris did not do too well in New Jersey. She won it by 6 points, but she really struggled, I would say, in the cities, right? Compare Essex County and Hudson County to even 2021, which, by the way, this was not a good performance for Phil Murphy either. He won by 3 points in a Biden plus 16 state, right? But still, Hudson County, Phil Murphy got 74%. Kamala Harris only got 63%. So we saw, even though Jack Ciattarelli put up a really impressive performance in 2021, Donald Trump did 15 to 20 points better than him in some of these areas in Newark. And that is substantial because it really cuts into Democratic margins. Kamala Harris in Hudson County, this is a deep blue county. She won it by what? Like, this is a 65,000 vote margin. That's not that much for a Democrat. Obama won it by a lot more. Even Joe Biden won it by a lot more. So tonight, I'm interested to see. The number of votes cast is going to decrease, but the turnout relative to the state is going to be important. Is Mikie Sherrill going to get a big, healthy margin out of Hudson County, out of Essex County, or is it going to be ticking down the way we saw in 2024 with Kamala Harris? So that's the first thing I'm watching for. This is going to be a hard thing to predict. Again, turnout here has been okay for Democrats. It could be a lot worse for them, which is why I think they could be a little cautiously optimistic. But also, a lot of these Democratic areas, especially urban areas, are election day voting precincts. So we're not going to know that as of right now, at least. Then the other thing I want to talk about, I've already touched a little bit on South Jersey, and I think Ciattarelli is going to actually put up a quietly impressive performance down here tonight. These are working class areas, like I said, trending away from Democrats. I don't think Mikie Sherrill has run the campaign to win these areas that decisively. Phil Murphy did really well here in 2017, lost a lot of it in 2021. Based on what we're seeing, I think nationally, just trends wise, it's going to stay pretty red. So then Morris County, we're going to come back to it, and Passaic will be interesting. If I had to guess, I think Passaic is going to be pretty similar to 2020. I do think it's going to be closer. I think it's going to be within 1 or 2 either way. Maybe it's a pure toss, but maybe Sherrill would take it by like half a point. But again, in 2021, even Phil Murphy still won it by 4, so it was still quite close. Now, let's talk about Morris County. Very educated area, very affluent. Turnout there should be pretty strong for both parties on election day. And this is a county that Trump won by 2. Now, it's more left trending, right? Joe Biden did really well here in 2020. It's, relative to the state, it's gotten bluer in the past 15 years. 15 years ago, South Jersey was a lot bluer and Morris County was a lot redder. Now it's kind of the reverse, where Morris County is pretty close to blue leaning, whereas South Jersey is pretty red. One thing I would really look out for in Morris County specifically is persuasion, right? Like I said, turnout here is going to be pretty strong. It's not going to drop off too much from either side. Morris County, if we see Ciattarelli, winning it by 5 or 6, which is an improvement from Trump's margin, that could be a sign that, hey, there are people who voted for Kamala Harris or who are moderate voters in this state who legitimately want Jack Ciattarelli to be the governor. That could be a promising sign for a really tight statewide finish. On the other hand, if we see Kamala Harris win, or not Kamala Harris, but Mikey Sherrill outperforming Kamala Harris here, maybe flipping the county back to the Democratic column after 2024 it went red, that could be a sign that Democrats are kind of getting their base back. They're getting those moderate voters who voted for Biden, but maybe not for Harris, back on board. So this is a bellwether to me. And I'd say for Ciattarelli to win statewide, he probably has to win Morris by 5 or 6, at least probably closer to 8, to be honest with you. Again, in 2021, he won it by 11. I don't think it's going to be that much for him no matter what, but watch for maybe like a high single-digit margin here for Ciattarelli. Although I will say this is Mikie Sherrill's home turf. She represented a congressional district in this area. There's reason to believe she could be stronger here than Phil Murphy, which is why I don't think she'll lose by 11, even if she does really poorly statewide. So that's what you should watch for. I know I was a little, I guess I could say I was a little bit North Jersey centric with the Morris County conversation and the Newark conversation. Also look out for Camden. It's another blue area that shifted a lot towards Trump in 2024. Turnout there could be interesting to watch. And then across kind of the central part of the state, it's going to be a bit more marginal, but I would expect Sherrill to run pretty even with Kamala Harris here. So what are we looking at? Like I said, Ciattarelli can win this race. And I know that's not a popular opinion in some circles. I know a lot of Democrats think they've got this one in the bag. I don't think so. I've said this a lot the past 2 weeks, but I'll say it one more time for old time's sake, because I'm never going to be able to say it again. Actually, I might in a recap video once the race is over. But like, Democrats are not in a good position here. They've been governing the state for 8 years consecutively with pretty limited GOP opposition. Phil Murphy's not popular. We saw in blue states in 2024 that people really turned against Democrats in the bluest areas. Right? Look at L.A., San Francisco, New York City, New Jersey. Another good example of this. Right? There is some voter fatigue at play, which could really help Jack Ciattarelli with some of those independent voters. Right? Don't get me wrong. That gives him serious upside. I think that makes the race worth watching. With that being said, with that caveat out of the way, couple problems for Republicans. Trump's in the White House. He's not popular in New Jersey. He's down by 10 to 15 points in net approval here in most polls. Atlas Intel had him -5. That's an outlier. Trump being in the White House energizes Democrats a little more than 2021. In 2017, when Trump first won, Democrats came back and flipped New Jersey pretty decisively. And I'd also say that even though there is some voter fatigue, it might be a little better this year than it was in 2021, just because Democrats are running a new face. It's not Phil Murphy again. It's Mikie Sherrill, who is a little bit fresher. She's not the incumbent governor, right? And then turnout, like I said, it matters. In terms of getting a baseline for the race, it does seem to be leaning a little bit more in the Democratic direction in terms of who I'd rather be at this point. So, without further ado, I'm going to predict a Sherrill victory of about 6.5 percentage points. I think it's going to be something, in terms of two-party vote share, I think Sherrill will probably be about 53.2, 53.3, Ciattarelli at 46.8 or 46.7. It's going to be interesting. I think there's a wide range of outcomes here. I wouldn't be too shocked if Sherrill won by 10, but I also wouldn't be shocked if it's like legitimately a 2-point race come election night. So that's all the more reason to get out and vote. It's all the more reason to really, take this race seriously. Above all, I'm excited to see how this turns out, and I'm excited to see what we get out of Morris County, out of Newark, out of Camden, and of course out of that south part of the state, because I think we could see some pretty wild swings. My opinion is that this is a pretty hard race to predict. I think, obviously, I'm relatively confident Sherrill will win, but I'm not fully sure. And then on the other hand, what I would say is that I'm a bit more confident about my Virginia prediction, which, speaking of which, I'm releasing it about 2 or 3 hours after this video comes out. So please comment down below what you think. Call your margin in the comment section so we can come back in a couple of days and see how close you were. And thank you so much. I'll see you very soon.